meet the young, inspire their vision. When you meet children, shape their minds with care. When you meet the elderly, serve them with compassion. When you meet the wise, listen, learn, and grow. When you meet true leaders, honor their responsibility. When you meet the foolish, keep your distance. When you meet the humble, hold them close. When you meet the arrogant, deny them your energy. When you meet the gracious, model their character. When you meet the ambitious, lift them higher. When you meet the strong, stand beside them. When you meet the godly, receive their blessing and pass it on. When you meet the aged, treat them with dignity. When you meet the weak, be their strength. When you meet the hard-working, fuel their perseverance. When you meet the kind, value them deeply. When you meet the honest, give them a platform. When you meet the virtuous, acknowledge their worth. When you meet the evil, walk away without regret. When you meet the broken, handle them gently. When you meet the lonely, offer your presence. When you meet the angry, respond with calm. When you meet the fearful, restore their courage. When you meet the jealous, protect your peace. When you meet the grateful, multiply their joy. When you meet the patient, learn endurance from them. When you meet the sincere, trust them carefully. When you meet the misunderstood, hear their side. When you meet the yourself, be honest, kind, and disciplined. When you meet the hurting, offer understanding before advice. When you meet the silent, respect what is unspoken. When you meet the proud, stay grounded yourself. When you meet the struggling, remind them they are not alone. When you meet the hopeful, protect their light. When you meet the doubtful, share clarity, not pressure. When you meet the impatient, model self-control. When you meet the generous, learn the joy of giving. When you meet the guarded, earn trust slowly. When you meet the curious, guide them wisely. When you meet the wounded, avoid reopening old scars. When you meet the respectful, return respect fully. When you meet the lost point, don't push. When you meet the confident, check your ego. When you meet the insecure, speak reassurance. When you meet the disciplined, study their habits. When you meet the distracted, bring focus, not noise. When you meet the peaceful, protect the moment. When you meet the learning, encourage progress, not perfection. When you meet the human, remember everyone is fighting something unseen. When you meet the world, leave it better than you found it. When you meet the darkness, be the light that guides. When you meet the journey, embrace the growth within. When you meet your purpose, pursue it with all your heart. Every moment, stay alert, stay prayerful, and wish good for all.
Like, share, subscribe. Thanks for watching.